Hello and welcome to another Rich Alvarez live stream. I am Rich Alvarez, it's past midnight my time, and I'm about to do a Final Fantasy tier list live right here on YouTube. So, I think let's get started, shall we? So, here's our tier list. Looks pretty tier list, right? Anyways, we're going to be talking about the Final Fantasy series, the series that I grew up with as a kid, and it has been my favorite series of all time, although it has spent the last 10 years kind of off and on my favorite games list because there's been some hits and misses, and everybody's been doing these tier lists, and these tier lists are like nothing new, but I've always wanted to do one, even though Chris and I have done like top 5 videos, top 10 videos, but for some reason putting it on a tier list instead of like a top 10 list seems to be like more hip now than these tier lists were like 5 years ago for some reason. So I decided to do a tier list. Anyways, let's cut to the chase here. So we're talking about the core games, and when I say the core games, I mean Final Fantasy 1 through 15, but minus like sequels. Like I'm not going to count 10-2, 13-2, 13-3. Like those games have merit, but they're not like, they're obviously made by like the B teams. They're not like the Tetsuya Nomura or the Hinobu Sakaguchi games that we all love. They are made by B teams that and some of them are good. Like 10-2 is okay, but like we're not talking about those. We're also not talking about the online games, even though I spent like a long time playing both Final Fantasy XI online and Final Fantasy 15 online. We are not talking about the online games because I feel like those are kind of their own category. They play very different. They are played in the traditional MMO style. I do think that Final Fantasy XIV is better than World of Warcraft for what it's worth, but that's a topic for another day. Anyway, so let's get to it. So Final Fantasy 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, 13, and 15 is what we are talking about today. So when we're talking about the original Final Fantasy, it is it was quite revolutionary at the time. We had a lot of well, not a lot of, but we had several like American RPGs that are like more in the point and click, and then text-based RPGs that had been around for a while. Obviously Dungeons and Dragons is like classic traditional tabletop RPG that have been around for a while. But when we think about JRPGs, there were a few that you could say kind of got the ball rolling there, but really it was Final Fantasy and the turn-based system and everything that everything that made that game what it was revolutionary. It took a lot of things and added a lot of new things. And for some people like my roommate Brandon, it's still their favorite Final Fantasy is the original Final Fantasy, and I feel like I still like it. The story is simpler than later stories in this franchise, but because it was so revolutionary for the time, and people often forget that like the reason why Citizen Kane is still considered the greatest movie of all time is not necessarily because of how well it holds up today, although I would argue that it still holds up fairly well in my opinion today. It's always about like how it was made, what were the sacrifices, what was the reaction at the time, because nostalgia is like so much of what makes a good story, a good story. We still celebrate classic folklore and tales from old, because they are timeless. But of course, a book or a story doesn't have the the degradation of graphics going bad or things like that. Unfortunately, video games sometimes do. But Final Fantasy continues to get the remastered treatment every once in a while. They've just come out with the pixel remasters of the first 6 games, which kind of cleans them up a little bit and presents them in a more like Super Nintendo as opposed to original Nintendo style. Of course 4 through 6 is already Super Nintendo, so they were just cleaned up a little bit. Anyways, I don't want to dig down deep in the history. Let's get to this tier list, okay? So yeah, as I've said, that's not it. That's where I was getting the music from. Here's the tier list. So let's get to it. Where should we place Final Fantasy 1? It's definitely not the best Final Fantasy game, but I think it's not the worst. And because of its history and because it is the first game and there wouldn't be any Final Fantasy games, hell, there probably wouldn't even be a Square or a Square Enix without Final Fantasy for that matter. I mean, by the way, guys, that's why they called it Final Fantasy, because if the game didn't work or didn't sell, the Square would have gone bankrupt. And therefore, it was their Final Fantasy. It could have been their Final Fantasy, so it's very fitting. I'm going to place Final Fantasy I, the original, all the way on the A tier list because I can play this today and still enjoy it. Again, it's not the best, but it's not the worst. While I'm live, I want to give a special shout out to Monkey Mafioso, Dan Erickson, Pingus Studios, Dustin Demon Slayer, and Darkness the Actor for being with me here live and enjoying this live experience. You know, I thought about making this an edited video and just, you know, putting it up as the tier list. Like, it'll probably do better as an edited video. But you know what? I really enjoy being able to talk to you guys live and, you know, interacting with you in that way. So I hope you appreciate this live tier list. Okay. So let's move on to Final Fantasy II. Final Fantasy II, it has a more complex story than Final Fantasy I, and I do enjoy Final Fantasy II, but I didn't feel like it added enough to really be you know, a whole like leap and bound above Final Fantasy I. And ultimately, you know, like, the story is okay, but I didn't, because it was more complicated and it didn't quite succeed where it needed to succeed in places where it needed to succeed. The simpler you know, story of Final Fantasy I kind of made Final Fantasy I more timeless in that way, since they didn't really have the characterization down with the characters in 2, even though I do enjoy the characters of 2. It's just not quite, I didn't feel like the story and the characters were, it's weird, right? Because they're more developed than they are in Final Fantasy I, but they're just not quite there. It's really interesting. I'm going to place Final Fantasy II in the B tier. Now, when we get to Final Fantasy III is really interesting because I remember back in the day, I had to like play a mod version of Final Fantasy III to be able to play it, because Final Fantasy III was, and you know, much like Final Fantasy II, by the way, I didn't mention this with 2, but I guess I remember it more with 3 because 3 was not released until even later than 2 in America. You see, well, really quick rundown. In America, because they didn't think JRPGs would do so well or whatever at first, we got Final Fantasy I like 3 years after it was released in Japan, and by that time Final Fantasy IV was basically going to come out, and so they released Final Fantasy IV in America as Final Fantasy II. And then they skipped 5, and then Final Fantasy VI came out on the Super Nintendo in America as Final Fantasy III. And so that's why a lot of people in America were confused when they decided to release Final Fantasy VII in America as Final Fantasy VII, and people were like, well, what happened to 4 through 6? And they didn't even know. They already got 4 and 6. They just missed 2, 3, and 5. So much like Final Fantasy II, I had to mod Final Fantasy III to be able to play it in America, although it was eventually released on the 3DS as a 3D remake, but it was like kind of a cheap 3D remake, and it's still good, but and Final Fantasy III does have some of my favorite music in the game, in the whole series. There's a couple of tracks that are still my favorite tracks in the series. I feel like they have finally released kind of the original Final Fantasy III in America officially as the new Pixel remaster. I believe that's the first time we're really getting it in America as its original incarnation, but you know, as the Pixel incarnation, Pixel remaster. Hello, Angelina Nasca. Thank you for joining in chat. But it does, where it has its strengths, it has its weaknesses, and it is a very good game. I also wouldn't call it one of the best, and I wouldn't call it one of the worst. I'm tempted. I wish there was a B+ rank. I'm very tempted to put it on A, but because it has the same kind of problems as Final Fantasy II, where the characters and story are good, but they're not quite there yet, Final Fantasy III goes in the B rank. Okay, wow. So now we move on to Final Fantasy IV. By the way, I didn't pick these pictures. This is on the tier, thing. I would have picked all the original cover art if I could, but doing this through the website, right? Hey, Killjoy's here. All right, Killjoy, we're doing Final Fantasy tier list. For those who missed it, Final Fantasy 1 A and Final Fantasy 2 and 3 in the B tier. So Final Fantasy 4, it is one of my favorite games of all time, no doubt. It is incredible. Some of the, just like 3, some of the best music in the series, but even more so. The theme of love from Final Fantasy IV is taught at schools in Japan, in fact, because it is so timeless and fantastic. And the characters of Cecil and Kain really resonate. They really resonate with fans then and today, so much so that over the years they've created sequels. There are like actual sequels to Final Fantasy IV, just like there are with 10 and 13. They don't quite match up to the original Final Fantasy IV, but it shows you how much people love Final Fantasy IV. And like 3, Final Fantasy IV also got kind of a pseudo 3D remake on the 3DS. But I love Cecil, Kain, Rosa, all the characters in Final Fantasy IV. It's a game I try to get back to at least every couple of years and play again, and I love it to death. And for that, it goes on the A tier, right there, next to the first Final Fantasy. Ooh, okay, so Final Fantasy V is, in my opinion, a big misstep, because it's almost like they had so much. They made, like, what I liked about Final Fantasy IV is that they were, instead of having like just kind of a random job system, which some people really like that. They really like to customize their characters, but I really feel like when you're doing a story-based RPG, you really want what your character does, even in battle, to kind of go with their character. And in Final Fantasy IV, that was like really working. Like, Cecil was a Dark Knight, and that was part of his character, and therefore that was also his class in the game. He had all the Dark Knight skills. Kain in the game for the Kingdom was a Dragoon, and therefore he played as a Dragoon. That really works. I feel like Final Fantasy V was kind of a step back, because it kind of went back to the basic like job system, like put any job on any character, it doesn't matter, they're kind of two-dimensional, and there are a couple of good tracks in the game, but it's I wouldn't even say it's any of Nobuo Uematsu's best work. And for the record, Nobuo Uematsu has done the soundtracks for almost all the Final Fantasy games except for some of the most recent stuff, because he's kind of semi-retired now, but he is what made Final Fantasy music great. He did 1 through 10, and then kind of has done some themes and some music scattered throughout the rest of the series. Anyways, so Final Fantasy V, it was really disappointing for me. It's not a bad game, but it is just an okay game. I'm going to go ahead and put Final Fantasy V in the C tier. All right. So we've got the first 5 Final Fantasies here. Then something amazing happened. Square knew that the Super Nintendo was kind of on its last legs, and they wanted to take full advantage of the console and just put their all into making the most incredible RPG that the world has ever seen. And at the time, and some would argue even now, they really did. Over a dozen epic playable characters, an incredible world that completely changes into a different, totally incredible world halfway through the game. Probably the most vile and nefarious villain in all of Final Fantasy, who actually completes his goal, and you have to defeat him after the fact. And just some of the best character development, and really, quite possibly still the best story in all of Final Fantasy. And that would have to go to the steampunk Dark Kingdom themed Final Fantasy VI. And we're going to go ahead and put Final Fantasy VI right up here in the S tier. And if there was a ultra tier, well, boy howdy, would it just be right up there. Now, again, a lot of you guys know that my favorite video game of all time is Chrono Trigger, because, man, after Final Fantasy VI, they're like, how are we going to top that? Chrono Trigger. But Final Fantasy VI is still one of the best games ever made, no doubt, hands down, It's pretty incredible. If you've never experienced Final Fantasy VI, I highly recommend it. Okay. All right. So now we go over to Final Fantasy VII. So, people always say, "Oh, it's the Final Fantasy that needs no introduction." Well, it is. It was so much of what made Final Fantasy VI good was carried over into Final Fantasy VII. I would say that the characters are a little weaker, the story's a little weaker. The villain Sephiroth is cool, but he's not as much of a villain really as Kefka was in Final Fantasy VI. Um, but what made Final Fantasy VII great is its presentation. Obviously, it was the first Final Fantasy and the first RPG to that scale in 3D, or what we thought was 3D back in 1997. Um, and it just had a huge world, with incredible side quests and scenarios, and you got involved in Shinra and the rebellion, and then later you want to try to find Sephiroth and figure out the mystery, and you get some of the answers. And again, we're not remake, just like we're not talking about remake here. We're talking about the original Final Fantasy VII. I couldn't even possibly rank remake until the entire remake is out, because remember, we only got like 1/10 of it so far, technically. Um, but even though the story and characters and everything aren't as good as Final Fantasy VI, there's enough in Final Fantasy VII. I love the idea of materia. I love the idea of the Mako and everything, and like kind of the lore behind Final Fantasy VII. And I fell in love with the world of Final Fantasy VII. I think everybody did, and that's how we're able to get things like Advent Children and Crisis Core and all those cool things. And I think it's the legend of Cloud and Sephiroth that have really held true more so than their actual characters. And just what the incredible fandom that happened in 1997 with Final Fantasy VII, and it being a huge triumph, not just for Square but for the PlayStation. Just kind of like dominating. The Final Fantasy series had always been a Nintendo game on Nintendo consoles, and then now Square was making it for PlayStation because of an argument they had with Nintendo over how they were going to make their next console. We can get into that in another video, but as much as I like a lot of N64 games, Nintendo kind of screwed up. They should have made a CD-based console. That's kind of end of story there. But anyways, they couldn't make. There was no way they could make Final Fantasy VII on Nintendo 64's hardware, so they made it with PlayStation. Anyways, I could gush on about Final Fantasy VII forever and forever, but I'm gonna put this guy in S tier. Anyways, all right. Woo. So we are going to move on to Final Fantasy VIII. And this is like, I feel like for some reason Final Fantasy VIII has become like the bastard child or the black sheep of the Final Fantasy world. And I understand where a lot of people are coming from. Like, again, my roommate Brandon, he's the only one that I know who's really played a lot of these Final Fantasy games. I think Chris has watched me play some of them. But anyways, Final Fantasy VIII, I love Final Fantasy VIII so much. It came out at a time in my life where I was going through some hard times in middle school, and maybe that's why I relate to the character of Squall. A lot of people are like, oh man, we went from like this cool, Midgar and Sephiroth to like just basically high school with this emo kid, and like he doesn't know his emotions and everything. And for whatever reason, I really dug it. It was just good for me at the time, and I because of that I was able to absorb everything that was the crazy ass lore of Final Fantasy VIII, and really get into it. I love the card game. I love that that's a constant thing throughout. I love it's a game that's about sorcery and time compression. Now that's where a lot of people have too many complaints about Final Fantasy. One, their characters are too emo, or two, they don't like the weird time, what they say, the time travel plot. What they don't understand is that it's not a plot about time travel, it's a plot about time compression. And there's a whole lot of quantum physics going on in that argument, which I find really cool. It's just a fascinating way to explain time bending because time and space kind of go hand in hand. And, I love things like Back to the Future and Avengers Endgame, where it's just like they kind of come up with some simple rules. Back to the Future, it's like, oh, you're going to change things. Or in, Endgame, they have, the whole, oh, you're going to create a multiple universe. I love those things. But what's cool about time compression is that when you compress time, events are all happening at the same time in the same place because space and time are bending. And I got a real kick of that. And I think that either went over a lot of people's head. I don't want to sound pretentious, like, it went over your head. But, like, sadly, I think it did for a lot of people. It is a really, really crazy concept to kind of wrap your head around, when you're a kid. But, like, I don't know. I started, like, reading quantum physics books and stuff after I played Final Fantasy VIII. I play Final Fantasy VIII once every few years because I love it so much. And, I see it as an adult. I kind of see more of where people were coming from with, like, the emo kid thing. But that emo kid thing, I feel like that only lasts, like, the first quarter of the game. And even then, it's not that bad. It works with the story, and the story was built around it. And then Squall, as a character, grows out of it and starts to express his emotions. It's a very human story. And there's a lot of character development in Final Fantasy VIII. And I feel like because the characters in Final Fantasy VII, and perhaps on purpose, were made to be a little bit more shallow so that it could reach a wider audience and have a broader appeal straight away. Going from 7 to 8 was a little bit rough for some people because now we're getting into people with some serious egos. But I love that dissonance there. So for me personally, and so far my list probably goes along with a lot of people's list, but this is where my list diverges. I'm putting Final Fantasy VIII in the S tier. So, suck on that, people who don't like it. I don't know, sorry. Final Fantasy IX is a great game, but I don't love it. And this is the second point to people not respecting my Final Fantasy opinion. And if anybody who's watching this is not a Rich Alvarez fan, this is where I've lost them. And again, Final Fantasy IX is not a bad game. It's actually, like I said, it's a great game. It is a great game. It's really up there with the best RPGs on the PlayStation. And, for a lot of people, some people, it's their favorite Final Fantasy. For me, I didn't love it. And I think what happens is there's two groups of people, and I'm in the smaller group where the bigger group of people loved Final Fantasy VII so much. And a lot of those people, by the way, never played a Final Fantasy before Final Fantasy VII. So Final Fantasy VII was their first experience with Final Fantasy. That's what they thought Final Fantasy was. Now, as someone who had played the other games, I liked 7, but I also liked 8 because I was used to a different character every time, a different story every time, a different feel every time. I was expecting something completely different with Final Fantasy VIII, and I feel like a lot of people that were just getting into the series or maybe had only touched on Final Fantasy a little bit before they played 7 didn't really understand that concept, and so for those people that loved Final Fantasy VII and or their first experience, they hated 8. So they either played 8 a little bit and gave up or skipped 8 completely. And so by the time Final Fantasy IX came around, enough time had gone on for them to, realize it's going to be a different thing every time. And they came to Final Fantasy IX with open arms, So I'm doing a little bit of psychology with this. I'm kind of breaking people's minds down. Like, what did they think? So Final Fantasy IX was extremely well received, and people love it because it was now the expectation that it was going to be something different. And so they didn't give 8 a chance; they gave 9 a chance, and they ended up loving 9. And Final Fantasy IX went back to a lot of earlier Final Fantasy concepts, and so people were drawn to that because some people hadn't experienced a lot of that stuff before, Or people that were huge fans of the original games but like hated 7 and 8 for their sci-fi elements, loved Final Fantasy IX for going back to those elements, and they also love Final Fantasy IX. But for me, and I guess those are 2 groups, so in total I guess there might be 3 groups. I don't like putting people into groups. There's a bunch of different people. For me though, I loved 6. I loved 7, and I loved 9. I love 6, I love 7, I love 8. And so when I got to Final Fantasy IX, it was really interesting because Final Fantasy starting, like six was a little steampunky, seven kind of started to have some like, cyberpunk feel to it, and Final Fantasy VIII had this nice like mix of like really like almost like European and Indian influences with some high tech stuff, and I thought it was going in this really cool place that eventually Final Fantasy X would also borrow from. And then nine to me kind of felt like a huge step back. A lot like Final Fantasy V actually. Final Fantasy IX, in common with Final Fantasy V, I felt like took a step back in the wrong way. It took all of the elements from other Final Fantasies and kind of just made a Final Fantasy around just older Final Fantasy elements. I know that's a circular argument. It's like obviously you want your sequel to be built around the things that made the previous one successful. But what made the good Final Fantasy games really great to me is that they didn't just take from previous games. They engineered new crazy ways to do them. Final Fantasy VI, we have Magitech, and the world of magic is kind of dead, and so there's this new steampunky science fiction element in there, and the way that things are done is different. And Final Fantasy VII introduced materia, and the way that magic is placed directly onto armor and weapons, and then you can't. I can't believe people get on Final Fantasy VIII's case for this, because to me, Final Fantasy VIII has the coolest pre-battle system with the junction system. Magic can be attached to your status, your elemental status and defense, your physical status and defense. Magic can be attached to every single statistical attribute of your character. You can add certain types of magic to, for example, your hit points to increase them, to your strength, your dexterity, etc., etc. Magic can be placed in like dozens of different ways to increase your base stats. And that's so critical. Like when you're in a place where you're fighting a bunch of fire monsters, for example, you can attach ice to your elemental attack to hurt them more, and you can attach fire to your elemental defense to make sure that when that fire hits you, you're absorbing that and it's healing you. You can really pre-plan the shit out of battles in Final Fantasy VIII. And then you can put some crazy magic like Ultima on your strength to make your weapons awesome. And people are like, oh, the junction system is too complicated, and I don't get, like, I just, that boggles my mind. Like, if you want an easy game, no offense to God of War, I like God of War, but play God of War where it's just kind of like you're on rails basically, and you're just pressing X button as fast as you want. You play an RPG because you want to deal with stats. I mean, again, like I said, RPGs, they really, the magical modern RPG is Dungeons and Dragons, and those games last for years sometimes. You spend your first like 10 hours of Dungeons and Dragons just building your character, and all you're doing is putting numbers in stat slots and rolling dice and figuring out numbers. And so if you're like me and you like numbers and you really like the classic RPG elements, then Final Fantasy VIII should have been your favorite Final Fantasy, because it all is numbers and attaching things to other things to make things happen. Anyways, that was a huge rant. I'm so sorry about the junction system. It just boggles my mind that people don't like the junction system. It's literally the coolest thing since sliced bread. Anyways, that's a long-winded way of saying that for me, Final Fantasy IX was a disappointment, but it's not a bad game. It's just not my favorite. I'm gonna go ahead and put it in the B rank for me. I was thinking about putting it in A, but like after I just dunked on it so hard, I'd feel like I couldn't justify putting it in the A rank anymore, but it will go in the B rank. In the middle. Okay. Then we move on to Final Fantasy X, the game that was originally supposed to be Final Fantasy IX, but then since they moved the development over to the PS2, they're like, well, guess we better make a Final Fantasy IX on the PS1, and so then they developed Final Fantasy IX. So it also shows you that Final Fantasy IX was kind of an afterthought. Final Fantasy IX returns to the cool, like, sort of medieval mixed with Indian mystical elements, mixed with high tech, mixed with a bunch of cool European influences, that kind of the stuff that really made the aesthetics of Final Fantasy VIII great, and it slapped it into Final Fantasy X. Now, because people had a big problem with the junction system, they came up with the sphere grid, which is a much more direct way of doing it. And don't get me wrong, I love the sphere grid. It's really cool to, be able to do the different grids for the different characters and kind of like, go into the other grids for other characters and like kind of collect different, abilities and stats and stuff. That's cool. It's very much simplistic, though, when compared to the junction system. However, the story of Final Fantasy X and the characters of Final Fantasy X are excellent. And of course, it was the first Final Fantasy to use voice acting, and I that was huge at the time, because then we actually got to hear these characters, and I was no longer, because I used to just sit in my room playing Final Fantasy games and do the voices myself, which is part of the nostalgia on its own. But like just all the voice actors did such a great job. There really isn't anything bad I can say about Final Fantasy X. It's definitely one of my favorite Final Fantasy games, and what's weird is, unlike 6, 7, and 8, where I have things to really, really gush about it's not like there was anything in particular about Final Fantasy X that was gush worthy. It's just the entire presentation overall was like really fantastic, right from the initial Blitzball game opener to the closing. I guess I won't spoil it in case. Hey, do you guys want 20-year-old spoilers? Well, I guess I won't say it, because the ending's so good. It's like even 20 years later, I don't want to spoil it. It's kind of a shocking twist, and it's really heartfelt and sad. But it definitely deserves a place at the top because, it being, what it is, just a great story. Great storyline, possibly it's like could be right up there with 6's storyline, to be honest. The only thing that it's just as good a story as 6, but not quite there with the gameplay as 7 or 8 for me, but just enough to get it in that top spot. I say no more. Love Final Fantasy X. It goes right up there in the S tier. So there we go. I'm just gonna leave it at that. Didn't have a lot to say about it, because it's so great, and I just want to keep it simple like that for 10, because everybody deserves to go in fresh to Final Fantasy X for the first time. So, yeah. Anyways. Now, we're going to skip 11, because, again, it was an MMO, and it was great, but it's completely different format, so we're going right to Final Fantasy XII, which was recently re-released as the Zodiac Age, so it could fix a lot of the initial problems with the original release. Unfortunately, it couldn't fix the wooden two-dimensional characters in it. I really felt like Final Fantasy XII was a Star Wars ripoff, and that might seem strange when it's this ethereal fantasy world in Final Fantasy XII. But if you break down the characters and their motivations, you get Star Wars. You get, this, simple, town, kid, instead of the simple farm kid, Luke Skywalker, who, meets a space pirate, who is basically Han Solo, and instead of Chewbacca, he's got, the rabbit woman, and they have to go save the prince. It's Star Wars, okay? It's just Star Wars. So there was nothing inventive about the story in Final Fantasy XII, and the gameplay, the way that you controlled one character at a time and kind of circled around the enemies and had automatic attacks, it just felt very much like Final Fantasy XI offline. That's the joke that we used to make. It's like, oh, if you played Final Fantasy XI offline, and people are like, how do you play Final Fantasy XI offline? I'm like, just play Final Fantasy XII. So to me, it's like the disappointment. That's where it really hit for me. I know some people, they talk about the Final Fantasy movie, The Spirits Within, but that's the time when Final Fantasy died. It's like that movie, although not great, had excellent special effects, and I thought that if anything, it showed what Square was. It wasn't Square Enix quite yet. It was Square. It showed off what they were capable of. They could make a 2-hour film and make it look awesome. The story wasn't great, but they made it look awesome. But they didn't really go, start to go, kind of, how do I say it? They didn't really go bottoms up and have to merge with Enix because they were going bankrupt until the development of Final Fantasy XII, because it took 5 years to develop, and nobody at Square could agree on what this story was. In fact, there was so much chaos at Square that Hinoru Sakaguchi, the creator of Final Fantasy, who had been director of the first 5 games and a producer up until this point, had to be let go from Square. He was the creator of Final Fantasy, was let go from the company because he didn't think Final Fantasy XII was a finished product that could be sold, and he was right. It wasn't. It was bad. And then they, put on a brave face and like, oh, he didn't know what he was talking about. He's got to get out of here. He doesn't know what he's talking about anymore. And then they released the Zodiac Age, 15 years later, and they're like, oh, sorry for the unfinished product. So now you're sorry. Anyways, it's a lot of stupid drama with Final Fantasy XII. So, oh boy, Final Fantasy XII goes right there in C with Final Fantasy V. Okay, guess what, guys? Oh, you're probably like, oh man, look at all these great games in the S, A, B, C. It's like, oh man, I guess Final Fantasy doesn't have any real stinkers, does it? And for some reason, my tier list doesn't have F. So I can only go down to D, but let's just consider D, F, okay? So far we've gone through 11 games, technically, because, 12 is, let's be real, Final Fantasy 12 is Final Fantasy 11. We've gone through 11 games, and none of them have been, terrible, right? Again, Final Fantasy V, Final Fantasy 12, they're decent games. They're not terrible. Okay, so, do I even want to get into this? I have so many other videos on this channel from when I used to do the Wiki Richie show. I've done YouTube Newses. That's how old this news is. I've done YouTube Newses on Final Fantasy XIII. I have done crossovers with other channels on what I think about Final Fantasy XIII. I feel like I'm almost nefarious now for my opinion of Final Fantasy XIII. I remember, the joke was that it was Final Corridor 13 or, On Rails 13. That was the joke that a lot of YouTubers were making back then. And I'll tell you why. Because it was on rails. Your character, is on a path, and you basically just push up on the controller to keep going on that path. Don't worry, your character will automatically jump and slide and duck under whatever obstacles in the way. You just keep pressing forward. And, there's no random encounters anymore. If you see an enemy, you can just walk around them, on your linear path. You just sidestep them. The magic of Final Fantasy was truly dead with 13. You got a bunch of dead weight, two-dimensional crap characters. You've got, the really, stoic hero with zero motivation. You've got the sister and her boyfriend, just really stock romance. And, I don't even want to get into it. Like I said, I literally could go on for hours about how terrible Final Fantasy 13 is. I wish you'd all just take my word for it. It's definitely a game worth skipping, and the fact that it has 2 direct sequels to it will haunt my dreams forever. But just, I'm not even going to continue on with this line of thought. Final Fantasy 13, the game should just die. This is in D rank, all right, which is F for me. F. Oh. Anyways. Okay, so now we finally get to Final Fantasy 15. And again, we're skipping 14, which is better than World of Warcraft. But it doesn't belong on this list because it doesn't follow the format again. Anyways, Final Fantasy 15. Oh, we got a lot of differing opinions on Final Fantasy 15 up in this house. It's not a Final Fantasy game. It's not quite a... Here's what I'll say about 15. I do like 15 a whole lot better than I like 13. Unfortunately, the reasons I like it more than 13, I don't know what I was saying. Did I say 15 and 15 twice? I'm saying I like it better than 13. It's a much better game than Final Fantasy 13. But despite it having marginally better characters and having an open world that feels closer to something like, I don't know, it's hard to say. It's like they tried to do like an open world, like almost like Red Dead Redemption style open world map, but it was like stretched to all hell and things, that's like there was nothing to do. There's a few towns you can go to and you can deliver some ramen or something or make some eggs. Like, and you get to certain points in the game where it like shows you like characters and characters' relationships, and instead of like actually explaining anything, it like goes to like a cutscene and it's like, oh, that event already happened, and then people tell you, oh, that's because you need to watch King's Glaive, the Final Fantasy XV movie that explains everything. But then you watch King's Glaive, and it's about a completely different character. And the main character, Noctis, who's in Final Fantasy XV, his father is in the movie, kind of, but it has very little to do. There's like one major event in the game that relates at all to this King's Glaive movie. The rest of the movie is completely unrelated, and instead, all you get is excuses from Square. The fact of the matter is that this game didn't start as Final Fantasy 15. It started out as Tetsuya's version of Final Fantasy 13 before they would allow Tetsuya to direct a Final Fantasy game. And that's like a whole nother conversation. Tetsuya Nomura, he has been with the company, almost from the beginning. He has, he obviously created the character. He was a character designer first. He created people are like, oh yeah, Cloud and Sephiroth. Like, those characters were designed, their look was designed by Tetsuya Nomura. And then he just wanted to be a game director, but instead of giving him an actual Final Fantasy game to direct, they gave him Kingdom Hearts. And of course, he directed all 3 Kingdom Hearts games. And was very involved in all the spin-offs as well. They promised him an actual Final Fantasy game in 13, and then decided that they didn't want him to direct Final Fantasy 13. So he had already started working on his own Final Fantasy 13, and when he learned that he wasn't directing Final Fantasy 13, he kept working on his game, and he called it Final Fantasy Versus 13, kind of to spite them in a way, because it was like, here's my 13, it's called Versus 13, so it's like Final Fantasy Versus 13. And so it wasn't really meant to be, and he kept developing it like that for a while. It was never meant to be Final Fantasy 15. It was supposed to be like kind of an alternate take on the themes of Final Fantasy 13, and some of those themes are kind of there, not really still in the game. But then, and it was going to be an action RPG. It was going to be not Final Fantasy really at all. He was trying something new with it, which is, fine. But then, when once again Square, just like with Final Fantasy IX, they were like, we need a Final Fantasy game and we need a mainline game. So, hey, Tetsuya, you've, we're sorry we didn't give you an actual Final Fantasy game before, but now you get an actual Final Fantasy game, and it's the game you've been working on. And so they turned Versus 13 into Final Fantasy 15. But here's the real kick in the balls for Tetsuya. At that time, they're like, yeah, you're going to direct Final Fantasy. Oh, but wait a minute. We need you to work on Kingdom Hearts 3, so you're being taken off of 15. So they tell him he's going to direct a Final Fantasy, a real mainline Final Fantasy. They change Versus 13 into Final Fantasy 15, but then they kick him in the balls, move him over to Kingdom Hearts 3, and then a different director takes over Final Fantasy 15 and screws it up. The game, because it went through so many iterations and has 2 different directors behind it, everybody can see the game is a mess. It's very uneven. The game starts a certain way and then kind of becomes an open world game in the middle and then ends in a linear way. The script is not there. There are giant pieces of character motivation just ripped out, and we're supposed to like assume, and they tried to do some DLC stuff later to try to fill in those gaps, but those were like too little too late. We just don't care about the protagonist very much. Like Noctis, you don't really care for him. I didn't. His his relationships, his friends, like there's a little bit of like this fun bromance stuff going on, but like it never really gets to like, I don't know, like the level that it should. And like he wants to get back to his girl back home, and like you don't really care about her either because you don't get to spend much time with her at all. And the villains don't make sense. It's so bad. Unfortunately, I can't rate it the lowest because it's not at all as unenjoyable to me as Final Fantasy XIII was. Because, to be honest, there's nothing can reach that low. Anyways, that's a long-winded way of saying that Final Fantasy XV goes in the C rank. Woo! Okay, how long did it take me to rate these games? I guess I've been doing this for like 45 minutes. God, I talk way too much, guys. Anyways, yeah. So that's it. Now we're about to. We've been getting trailers for Final Fantasy 16. Looks like they're, because of some of the negative reaction to Final Fantasy 15, they're really kind of harkening back to that medieval stuff again. It's like what Final Fantasies do. That's what they do. It's like they try something, it doesn't work, they fall back on older themes, rinse and repeat. It's like they just haven't quite found a formula that has really stuck with them and been a huge success, honestly, since Final Fantasy X, which, in my opinion, as you could see on this list, Final Fantasy X is the last great Final Fantasy game and might remain so forever. Who knows? It was the last Final Fantasy game produced by Squaresoft before it had to go bankrupt and merge with Enix. So, for so many reasons, it hurts me. It hurts me. This was my favorite series growing up, and it just kind of turned to dog crap. Anyways, yeah. Oh, that's funny. Thanks, Darkness, the actor. He pointed out that the whole thing forms an F shape. That was not on purpose. That is really funny though. Anyways, I hope you've enjoyed this tier list. I don't know what I was trying to accomplish with this. Just making a tier list, and maybe in hindsight, since this has lasted so long, maybe I should have made an edited down one. I don't know if you guys really enjoyed this. I don't know, but yeah. If you guys did enjoy my long-winded explanation of things, let me know. Don't forget to like this video. I see 16 viewers right now and only 12 likes. Go ahead and like. And then, of course, subscribe if you haven't. I think everybody here has basically subscribed already, but you could go ahead and like it again. Ooh, hiccups. Anyways, it's late. It's like 2 in the morning over here. But yeah. I think next time I feel like doing a stream late at night, I'll just do a Q&A. So that way I get you guys more involved. But this was fun. I enjoyed myself. I hope you guys enjoyed yourself. And yeah, that's not even that. Yeah, that is. Thank you. That is some of my insight, Darkness. But I have so much more to say. But if I said it all, it would take days. But I'll leave you guys with this. Thank you guys for watching. Please subscribe. And yeah, we'll see you next time. Bye bye.